We'll just explain, the team are just turning up, so we'll go for a couple of minutes. So if they want to set up, we'll probably we'll start with the any apologies. We have apology from Thelma Bell. Any further apologies? We're all here. All those in favour of this apology be sustained. Leave absence granted. Please say aye. Aye. Carried. Extraordinary business. Conflicts of interest or conflict of interest declaration. Confirmation of the minutes, environmental services from 7th of February 19. Any changes on page 1? 2. Somebody like to move this be a true and correct record of these minutes and they be confirmed?
I'll move that.
Councillor Wilson, Councillor Rawlinson. All those in favour, please say aye. Those against? Carried. A couple of minutes just set up. How long is it going to take? 5 minutes to set up? Or we might move to 5.2, is it? 5.2 in the Methven Dog Park while that gets set up. Ask Mr. Hyde, would you like to come to the back of the room so that you can be a television star for the day, please? Page 51, isn't it? Yep. Do you want to say a few words to start it?
No, he knows what he's doing.
Righto, when you're ready, Ian. We know your competence is very good, so you can run it from your corner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I believe that this notice of requirement and the project is probably familiar to most councillors. It was presented last year to go out to pre-application consultation, initial consultation, which we did in the latter part of last year. You'll see in the report that there was one submission that we received in response which expressed concern from residential properties along the site boundary. We have taken that into consideration and in conjunction with our open spaces team have come up with a proposal for soft landscaping on the boundaries of the property, which I think will not only hopefully allay some of the concerns of that person, but also make a more aesthetically pleasing environment for the dog park. So I hope that the report and the notice of requirement sort of stands on its own merits, but if there are any questions, I'm most willing to answer them.
Questions around what's there? It's a pretty good report. I understand what it is, sort of looking at it for a while. Any questions on that? Councillor Lovett?
I just had one question. Like the one person was asking for a wooden fence to be built. What type of fencing is already there now? Is it just wire?
Is it
wire or what? Yeah.
through the chair? I believe it's deer fencing. Is it reasonably high deer fencing surrounding the property?
With
yes.
Fine mesh around it.
Yeah, with puppy mesh. Yeah.
Any further? Councillor Brown? Sit too close.
Under financial implications, Ian, talk about the proposal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under financial implications, the proposed cost be met through reserve funds. Could you tell us which reserve fund? Is it the dog reserve fund or what reserve fund will it be met from?
We were proposing the reserve contribution fund because it's not just the dogs that exercise, it's the owners keeping around as well.
And just leading on further from that, there will be an ongoing cost from the open spaces team for the mowing and maintenance of it. We know their budgets are fairly tight now and you know, struggling to keep up with some of the workload. Who already mows this space at the moment? Is it them? And is David comfortable with that and able to handle it within his budget?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes he is. We've discussed that with him previously, and in the report prior to this one we'd also flagged that it would be an additional cost for open spaces. But he sees that as just being part of providing facilities for the public. At the moment, it doesn't really cost the property team, commercial property team, anything because there are sheep from the fire station eating the grass.
Councillor McMillan?
Thank you. I like the look of the trees that you're going to plant along the fence line. So how high will they be when they're planted, and how quickly do you think they will grow?
Through the chair, that's a very good question. I am no landscape architect, but there is a landscape designer. But you know, you've got Kowhai and some lemonwoods there that are reasonably well growing, tall growing. I guess the intention was that the plantings were to provide screening at, sort of equivalent to a fence, perhaps a little bit higher, but that's really the major part of it, and you can see that the most of it is going to be the Coprosma flax and Mullenbeckia, which will sort of bulk it out a little bit. In terms of how long it takes to establish, look, honestly, I can't answer that. It will take I guess it depends on the size of the plants when they're first established as well, but it will be a couple of years, I would say, or a year.
Councillor Braham?
If I might answer that question, most of it will be 5 meters high. The meadows, the lemonwoods could be up to 7. You would have a screening if you start with 500 mil plants within 2-3 years. But the reason I push this button, if there's no more questions, I like to push the motions as it stands.
Just speak up a wee bit. Could you say the last line again, please?
Yes, I can. I like to move the recommendation 5.22 as it is standing.
Oh, I'll second that, thank you.
Thank you.
Looks like these speakers are turning on, and also you might have to glance down after you put your fingers just to check that they're staying on. So we'll call back to the table. Are the team ready to go to make the presentation? We can wait a few seconds while you get it all set, if you like. Right, we'll move back to the matter on the earthquake initial response plan, and the team that's come today, and you'll see once you get through it a wee bit that there's the plan for Ashburton. So, James, would you lead away, please?
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Council. I would like to introduce Professor Tom Wilson from Canterbury University and James Thompson from Canterbury Civil Defence Emergency Management Group in Christchurch. Both gentlemen have been heavily involved in the AF8 project, and this project is what led us to our initial response earthquake plan that you have here today. So I will hand over to Tom and James to present what they now have as additional findings and research in regards to that.
Thanks, James, and thanks for inviting us to be here with you today. I'm James Thompson. I'm with the Canterbury Civil Defence Emergency Management Group, and been involved in working with the 6 South Island CDM groups and with Tom Wilson to understand what alpine fault is really going to look like and to bring together the framework and the planning around it. So I'm just going to introduce it very quickly, and then I'll hand over to Tom, who's going to take us through the exciting stuff of the science and what we know about alpine fault, and then I'll finish off with where we are going from a South Island perspective and how that impacts on our Canterbury districts, district councils. So Project AF8 it's a 3-year program designed to model the earthquake and then look at the response planning and the community engagement that we need to have coming out of that. It sort of started really with our Alpine fault scientific modelling. So a bunch of scientists have been pulled together from different disciplines in New Zealand to bring that together. And then to look at what the impacts of that rupture of the Alpine fault would be on all of our South Island communities. And so it's involved our 6 South Island CDM groups, and a lot of that work was done through a series of collaborative workshops that we held throughout the South Island and actually up into the North Island. And the outcomes are really to understand those consequences, and then to go through and identify our initial response actions, some of our interdependencies, things that we know we're going to have to rely on each other to get a good outcome for our communities. What our priorities for response are, working with our emergency service partner agencies, opportunities to improve our emergency management arrangements, and then really to go into looking at how we plan for community resilience around this particular hazard. Just go through to this slide here. There's been a fantastic amount of work done across research, policy and practice. Probably one of the strongest events or projects we've seen in New Zealand in a long time, where the research has been used to inform what we're doing, to work with policy and with the practitioners to actually come up with a result. And we've ended up with some significant government funding in behind this. So I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to take us through the research, and then I'll finish just with a bit around the planning and where we've got to.
Great, thanks so much, James, and thanks everyone for having us here today. I'm actually a Ashburton district lad. I grew up in Methven on a small farm just north of Methven there, so I'm really pleased to be back here, so thank you very much for having me. So my background is, I trained as a geologist, but then got into disaster science and spent time at GNS Science and overseas, and then came back and now based at Canterbury Uni. So my role is really trying to understand what the geophysical processes might do and what the impacts on society could be. And so we work very closely with the likes of James and others. So what I'm going to go through today is give you an understanding of why we think the Alpine fault is something to worry about, and to present some of the world-class science that's been done on this, and then to dig into some of the more recent work around what the likely consequences will be. And then James will pick it back up and finish off with where are we going next with AF8 as a project. The way that I'm going to tackle it is start to just go through the different elements of what we know about the fault and why it might be a problem. So the first thing that we'll look at is how big is this event likely to be in the future? And we'll use the term magnitude for that. So that's how much power or energy is going to be released in the next earthquake from that fault line. The next thing to think about is how frequent these things might be, or what's the probability of that event going to be in the future. But where someone like me, who's interested in what the consequences might be, it's the hazard footprint tends to be the most useful. So what is the area that's going to be affected? And in particular, the intensity. So how strong or long those effects will be in space and time. So what are we in this room going to experience with that future earthquake? So how much shaking, how long will it go for, and how violent might it be? And that's when we can start to assess what those consequences might be for different communities around the South Island and beyond. But as we all know, consequences tend to be the key thing that we want to know about. So we've put a lot of work into that over the last couple of years, and we'll be looking to present a lot of that information. The other way that we can look at it is the classic sort of big bad wolf analogy. So one of the things that hazard scientists get very passionate about is all the fiddly diddly stuff with how the earthquake might work and how the volcano might erupt and all that sort of carry on. But we need to think a bit more holistically. So the elements when we're thinking about what the impacts might be is someone like me will take it from the point of view of what's the hazard, so what's the impact or the spatial extent and the shaking intensity, what might that be? And then we combine it with what exposed elements might we have. So that could be buildings, could be people, could be cultural assets, could be political assets, whatever the case that you're interested in. And when we combine them together, it's through that process or that concept of vulnerability. So in the case here, we've got the big bad wolf blowing, and he's blowing on different buildings with their different attributes. So some are made of straw, some of those houses made of sticks, and others are made of brick. They'll all have different responses to that hazard event. And so that when we understand that, we can start to design what the mitigation effects might be most useful. What we'll go into now is just to think about what the magnitude of this future event might be. So when we're thinking about earthquakes, the simple thing is to think of how big is the fault line and how much is it going to move, and that should give us an idea of what the amount of energy will be released. So the simple analogy is if you put your hands together and then like that, press them really tight and then move them, you'll feel heat being generated, and that's the energy being released. So in the case of the Alpine Fault, it makes up, it's a key part of the tectonic plate boundary in New Zealand. So much of the South Island is part of the Pacific tectonic plate. And on the western side of the South Island, it's the Australasian or Indo-Australian plate, whichever one you want to call it. But the Alpine Fault makes up that boundary where those two tectonic plates meet and grind past each other. The way that they're grinding past each other is along this big axis, along the Southern Alps, and it was first recognised about 50 or 60 years ago where, I'm not sure if my mouse is going to show this, but for those of you that can see the imagery there, the rocks that you can see in the southern part of Southland and through into northern Otago are the same types of rocks which are up the top of Northwest Nelson, but on the western side. And what's happened there is through a number of, probably thousands of earthquakes along the Alpine Fault, they've been displaced over 400 or 500 kilometres. So that was one of the first things that geologists started thinking, oh, there might be something going on here. And then there's that nice big lineation that you can see along the western part of the Southern Alps, where there's a very straight line, which is what we now recognise as the Alpine Fault. We reckon that there's about 400, 450 kilometres worth of fault line that's been recognised as making up that plate boundary. And so what we're seeing is if we've got our hands together, we're just seeing that intersection on the surface where our hands meet. But it actually goes down deeper into the crust and probably just starts to bow round underneath the Southern Alps there. What we can start to think about is how much it might move in a future event like that. And with that sort of distance of about 400 kilometres of fault length, that usually means around about magnitude 8, magnitude 8.2 perhaps at the upper end of what a future earthquake might look like. But let me go into that a bit more detail. So just to give you some context here, the way that might look, so when we talk about a magnitude 5 earthquake, the amount of slip area, or the surface of your hands when you're putting them together, a magnitude 5 is about the size of the 4 avenues in Christchurch, moving about 10 centimetres. So that's how much energy is released when that type of earthquake happens. When we go up to a magnitude 7, so something like the Darfield earthquake from way back in 2010, that's where we have around about 2 Christchurch urban areas moving around about 2 metres, maybe 2.5 metres. So that's how much energy gets released. When we go up to a magnitude 8, that's around about mid-Canterbury, or probably a little bit bigger than the Ashburton district, moving probably around about 5 to 6 metres. So think of Ashburton district on your hands moving 5 to 6 metres. And that's how much energy gets released there. And that's about what we would expect with an Alpine Fault earthquake. So of the last 9 earthquakes that we've picked up on the Alpine Fault, so that's where we dig into the fault line and look at how many times it's been displaced and different soils and things have been produced, it appears that about 8 of them have been over 400 kilometres length fault ruptures. So that's where along that fault line we're seeing almost the whole fault rupturing. Now there's a bit of uncertainty with that. The fault is not just a big straight lineation. There's lots of different segments to it, but it does appear that when it ruptures, it's relatively likely that the whole thing will go. So if you remind yourself back to the Kaikoura earthquake back in 2016, there was multiple different segments of faults which all ruptured. It'll be something similar to that with the Alpine Fault, but it's likely that instead of just part of the Hope Fault rupturing, like we saw in the Kaikoura earthquake, we might see the whole segment of the Hope Fault going, which would be the equivalent. The fault has enough stored energy to move about 8 metres horizontally and up to 2 metres vertically. Has anyone driven through Franz Josef? So do you know where the petrol station is? You know, there's that little terrace that you go past. Anyone notice it's about 2 metres high? Guess what that terrace is? That's the fault trace. So it's probably from the 1717 AD event. And so we would have seen about 8 metres differential movement on that fault when that ruptured, and the 2 metres vertical there. So you can still see that very much in the landscape today. Not an ideal place to put a petrol station. So we think, and this is about as good as geology gets, we think the next, very high likelihood that the next earthquake on the Alpine Fault will be magnitude 8. So that will be 32 times more energy than was released in the Darfield earthquake, and well over 1,000 times more energy than was released in the Christchurch earthquake. But remember what I said for a start, it's around the spatial extent of where that will be affected. So this will be a big South Island-wide footprint, which is affected, and some of the damage across here on the eastern coast of the South Island is likely to be a little bit less because our shaking intensities will be lower. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the thing that's probably the most compelling here is whilst this is a very boring plot, it's probably some of the most exciting science that's been done in New Zealand earthquake area for the last 10 years. What you're seeing here is one of the best records on Earth of previous earthquakes on a fault line. What GNS scientists and people from Victoria, academics from Victoria University and Otago University have done is dug up and down the Alpine Fault area, and especially looking at areas where the fault trace runs through swampy ground. And because what you can do there is when you have those 8-metre displacements and the vertical displacements, is that often in a swampy area, you'll capture bits of organic material. And especially if you've got a river coming over the top of it, big landslide and gravel and other bits and pieces coming over the top and cap that organic material after the earthquake, is that becomes a record, a carbon record of what the date of that earthquake might be. And so what you're seeing here is we're here in 2018, and this is going back in time. So this is back 2,000 years ago, all the way back to about 8,000 years ago. What we're seeing here is all the different events that the scientists have picked up in that fault trench and dated the carbon. And the little histograms that you're seeing is the uncertainty range of what they think the age of that carbon was. So what we can see here is that it's a very regular occurrence of earthquakes through time. So if we look at that trend, that plot line, there's a little bit of wiggle, but that's about as linear as it'll get in terms of earthquake behaviour. So what we can call this, if we were to personify it, is this is a very well-behaved fault. It occurs very regularly through time. There's been 27 earthquakes over the last 8,000 years on this fault line that we can pick up. Very regular, as I said. The longest intervals, about 500 years between events in terms of the median age dates. And the shortest intervals, about 140 years, again, between these median age dates. But on average, it's rupturing around about every 300 years. The last known event was in 1717 AD. So we're 301 years. What are we? 302 years. So, here we go. So what that means is there's a conditional probability, for those of you that are into that sort of thing. It's about a 30% chance of another Alpine Fault earthquake occurring in the next 50 years. That's about as good as we can get in terms of being able to forecast when a future big event like this gets. And I'm not just saying that from a New Zealand context. This is as good as it gets in the world. So we as a community are very fortunate to have this information. Okay, so that's all very well and good. I can see a few people wiggling uncomfortably in their chairs. Good, so you should be. Now, let's think about what this might look like. So this is a very quick and dirty plot that we can calculate of what the shaking intensity might look like across the South Island. So this is a very simple empirical plot. So it's something that you could run very quickly on your computer in about less than 10 seconds. And it gives a forecast of where the likely shaking intensity might be across the South Island. So we use these quite commonly when we're trying to quickly model what a future earthquake might look like. So what you can see is close to the fault line, there's very high levels of shaking. So an MM8, MM9 shaking is something where you would start to expect structural damage to most buildings, and very, very upset people and some issues for our critical infrastructure and so on. And you can see that attenuates across the rest of the South Island. So a little bit like dropping imagine that cavity here in the middle of the room as a pond. If we threw a pebble into the middle of it, we'd see waves radiating out, but their amplitude would get smaller as the energy dissipates away. So here in Ashburton, we'd be forecasting something around about an MM6 shaking intensity, which is quite manageable, not too bad at all. Probably a little bit more than what you received after the Kaikoura earthquake. But again, this is a very, very simple model. But by comparison, here's the Darfield and here's the Christchurch earthquakes using the same model. So that the key take home from this is that this will be a South Island-wide event. It won't be a regional event like we saw with those previous earthquakes. This will be South Island-wide. But what we've been able to do is, with some of our collaborators, especially in the civil engineering department at Canterbury, is they're looking at using state-of-the-art physics-based ground motion simulation models. Sounds a bit of a mouthful. But basically what it does is it gives us a chance to look at how that shaking might propagate in space and time with high degree of accuracy, and incorporating in the soils or the rocks and things that the waves are going to move through. So I'm going to run this video here. And what you're going to see is a greatly amplified shaking intensity. But we're seeing the earthquake start down here in the southern part of the fault line. We don't know where it's going to start, we're just guessing, but this is the highest consequence scenario. And as you're seeing that fault unzipping, the seismic energy is radiating out away, but the problem is that the fault's rupturing at about the same velocity as the earthquake waves are moving away from it. So it basically means it's like a car coming towards you with that sound stacking up or amplifying, superimposing on itself. So it's you're getting this great big wave train starting to be produced. So as it's moving through past through Franz Josef and now hinting into the Canterbury Basin, you're seeing quite a lot of energy all stacked up on itself. Now that it's entered the Canterbury Basin, the unconsolidated, quite sloppy basin, with gravels and whatnot, it slows the waves down a bit, and it means they amplify. And so we see enhanced shaking activity. It's just reached Christchurch, and you're seeing Christchurch with that terrible place to build a city from an earthquake perspective, really amplifying. But you can see that it's still rupturing at this stage. You're seeing that big wave train moving through into Blenheim and Nelson now, and eventually it'll carry on into Wellington. Again, this is about as good as it gets. This is a very state-of-the-art modelling, and we're lucky to have that capability here in New Zealand. I'll run that again, because everyone loves looking at it a couple of times. But what I'd really like you to focus on is think of the footprint across the South Island and what we're seeing here in central Canterbury as those waves start to enter into that Canterbury Basin. And I'll just talk that through again. The Canterbury Basin is mainly filled with fluvial glacial deposits, so unconsolidated material, and it means it slows down the seismic waves as they get into it, and it means that they amplify the shaking intensities. So even though we're a little bit further away from the fault line itself, we're not necessarily always built on the best soils. And especially really, really fresh soils that have just recently been deposited means you can have quite high amplifications and particularly liquefaction potential, especially if your soils are saturated with water. So here we go, Ashburton's just got the good news. And then you're seeing those big secondary waves coming in and causing issues. This is always the part of the talk, James, where everyone goes very quiet.
What's your time frame do you believe it'll be from starting in Fiordland through to Canterbury?
So we're probably about 2 minutes. So on the top right corner there's a time track. It's just slightly accelerated. The thing I should really stress here is we don't know where that rupture is going to begin. It could be in the middle, it could be at the top. This is the worst case scenario for Canterbury. If you started from north to south, then Southland has a pretty bad day.
And how long would the shaking last for in Ashburton?
Somewhere between 3 to 6 minutes. Yep. So it'd probably be fairly severe for the first minute or two, and then start to to decrease. Probably not too much more, a little bit further more than what you got with Darfield and maybe Kaikoura, but just, yeah, probably next level up and probably a lot longer.
Councillor Price.
Thank you.
Oh, oopsie, sorry. Uncontrolled fear.
Oh, sorry. A lot of activity going on around Rakaia River mouth, and it lingered there for a long time. What can you explain what that is?
There we go, sorry. So what you're seeing there is very freshly deposited soils and they're saturated. So it's creating a little mini basin where the waves are slowing down and reflecting off the boundaries of that basin, so it sort of resonates. And you might hear some earthquake scientists say things ring like a bell, and that's sort of what you're seeing there happen in those little micro basins. Okay, so I know we're under a little bit of time pressure, so I'm just going to keep going here, but we will be able to stop for questions in a minute. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind here is, so we'll have a good shake across the South Island, but earthquakes, as we've seen with particularly Kaikoura and the Christchurch earthquake, is they're not just all about the primary hazard. So we could get earthquake, and then in the Southern Alps, we're likely to see a lot of landsliding. In fact, we know we will. So we've seen that happen after previous events, and probably the best example is what we saw after the Kaikoura earthquake in 2016. So big landslide can occur, sometimes it can dam rivers, and then sometimes they can break out catastrophically. So that will be a big issue for our transportation corridors and likely create challenges on the West Coast, but also for our inland areas for the East Coast District Councils. So Ashburton, Waimak and so on will have challenges up there. Sometimes these secondary hazards in developed nations who have strong building codes and relatively strong land use planning means that the secondary hazards can often have the worst effects because they're much more challenging to design and plan for. And we've seen that in, for example, Indonesia, in Japan with tsunamis, Christchurch with the liquefaction and rockfall on the Port Hills, and certainly Kaikoura with the landslides. They tend to be the most challenging. Lots of examples from this. I don't want to linger on it because everyone's probably had a good look at this, but landslide dams following the Kaikoura earthquake and the disruptions to the transportation network alone were really quite challenging and isolating for our rural communities, but also for major exchange of goods and things between our major urban centres. Liquefaction susceptibility is something we've also been putting a lot of effort into. This is some of the most recent work, and again, as I said before, some aspects of the Ashburton district will have potential to liquefy. This is a national model that's been produced and just gives a little bit of a sense as to where some of the more vulnerable areas are. And we will have aftershocks, and they will carry on for months to years afterwards. This plot here that's been, or this map here that's been produced is just one potential aftershock simulation. It's really, to be honest, just a guess. We've modelled, I think, close to 1,000 to give us a catalogue of potential options. But the main take-home is that it's very uncertain as to where our aftershock sequences are likely to be. But there's some general rules in that the areas close to the fault are likely to have a higher probability of aftershocks occurring, and particularly at the tips of the fault line that's ruptured, that's likely to be a concentration of where earthquake activity will occur. And if you remember back to the Canterbury earthquake sequence, after that Darfield earthquake, it was in the tips or close to the end of that fault line that really the concentration of aftershocks occurred, and probably why we saw the migration of earthquakes across Christchurch City. Other things that we can sometimes see is fires, flooding, other infrastructural challenges after events like this. Okay, time for a quick break and any burning questions around the hazard scenario. That's some of the background hazard information that we've been collating and pulling together. And usually it's a good time to stop for a few quick questions. And then the next part of the talk is what are the impacts to the critical infrastructure systems, and then on to some of the management stuff that James will talk about.
Yes, madam, you can.
Thank you. Tom, you mentioned liquefaction. Is there any data available of areas within Ashburton District that might be prone to liquefaction?
I'm not intimately familiar with that, but your engineers will have access to all of that within the council. What I am well, I could off the top of my head, I can almost guarantee I know where the areas will be, close to the rivers and areas where you've got low-lying saturated areas. But I think there has been a lot of work characterising areas around that, so I can certainly look that up for you if your engineers don't have it, which I'm almost 100% sure that they will. Perfect.
Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. Just in regards to the probability, I saw that right now it's 29% over the next 50 years. As we go along, roughly what's the formula for modifying that probability percentage?
So the longer that we don't have an earthquake, the higher the probability will be on an annualised basis. At some point it tips over and starts getting lower. As a funky nature of statistics, but certainly within all of our lifetimes in the room, unless someone lives more than 200 years here, it will just keep going up and up and up. So I can't remember, sorry, I probably should have prepared for this because I always get this question, but certainly if we project into the next 50 years, actually a better way to put it is in my lifetime, I would be exceptionally surprised if I don't see an Alpine fault earthquake. I'm 35 now.
McMillan?
Thank you. You said there'd been 27 earthquakes along the Alpine Fault. Do you know what magnitude they had been? Is there any way of knowing that? And is an 8 magnitude normal?
So the best data we've got is for the last 9 earthquakes, where we've been able to dig out across multiple locations across the whole fault line as to how much of the fault seems to have ruptured. And it certainly seems that 8 of the last 9 have had about 400 kilometres of rupture, or at least something's moved at some point. So there's a little bit of uncertainty of did it all go at once, or did we get one segment and then another segment following quite soon after? So it could be minutes, hours, days, we're not sure. So we just don't have the resolution for that. But applying the precautionary principle, I would say it would be best to assume that we're likely to see a magnitude 8 earthquake in a future event. And then anything less than that, ripper.
Chief Executive?
Thank you. I wonder if there's any data on historical earthquakes and where in the fault line they've started. So as we saw that simulation and perhaps worst case, is that likely if you look at a historical view?
We don't know is where it will initiate. So the types of tools that we look at for trying to pick up where earthquakes have been is we can either dig the fault line out, try and have a look at the soils, that won't tell us. The best sort of thing that we can look at is often the dendrochronology, so what are the effects on the trees and where that may have occurred. That tells us that there's been an earthquake and that there's often been a lot of landsliding, but still it doesn't have that resolution of within minutes where has the shaking come from or what the issues might be. So it's a bit of it'd be interesting if we ever get to the point where we could pick up where that's occurred. So no, I don't think we'll ever be able to. So hence we've shown you probably the worst scenario for Ashburton and Canterbury and Wellington. But like I said, if it started in the north and went south, Southland would have a bit of a bad day.
Councillor Urquhart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With a magnitude 8 like this, probably wouldn't affect us too much, but what's the chances of a tsunami? I guess it moves away from the earthquake mostly, but does it come back at all?
So for a tsunami, at this stage, there doesn't seem to be much evidence for the fault line progressing offshore. So we're unlikely to see the ocean displaced in a substantive way. It is a little bit uncertain where the fault line enters the ocean off Fiordland. So there could be some potential tsunami there. Probably the thing in Canterbury that we'd be much more concerned around is a seiche or like a lake tsunami, where either like a bathtub, the lake is displaced or sort of shook so that water's displaced and sloshing sort of occurs, or where we might have a landslide entering into a lake or an underlake slump or something like that, which again might displace the water column. In Ashburton District, some of your inland lakes may be exposed to some aspects of that, but certainly I know there's been a lot of work by ECAN on the hydro lakes down in South Canterbury. So there has been quite a bit of work starting to work up on that.
So, Brian?
Mr. Chair, why do you start on south? Why do you say it starts in south and goes north and not the other way?
It gives us it's the most damaging scenario particularly for Wellington, and therefore it's very motivating for some of the policymakers there. We've computed a central rupture and a north to south rupture as well. They're all available online, so I can give you the link after this meeting if you would like, so you can check them out. But yeah, really it's the most consequential or the most severe shaking for this district. So that's just why we've shown you that. But we're certainly using that for the other scenarios for the risk assessment work that's been done. Great. Okay, I'll steam into the next bit. Okay, so one of the areas that we started on with AF8 was to look at critical infrastructure. There's a very strong infrastructure culture or lifelines culture in Canterbury. We're very lucky to have a very motivated, very well organised lifelines group who have done a lot of work and some of the early seminal work all the way back in the 1990s around looking at earthquake resilience. And so what I mean by critical infrastructure or lifelines is power systems, water supplies, telecommunications, roading, and so on. So one of the things that we got stuck into early on was we did a lot of modelling and all the usual stuff you'd expect the nerds to do, but we also worked a lot with different stakeholders and community engagement around what the likely impacts on different infrastructure networks would be, particularly with NZTA, Transpower, and some of particularly the West Coast areas. But we tried to go a step further and worked a lot with different communities around what would the loss of different infrastructure services mean for them. And so we focused in on the likes of Franz Joseph community and a few others across one or two in Canterbury to help give a better richness to some of that planning. So trying to move away from just damage and to the physical assets and more thinking about what the loss of service might mean for those communities and the knock-on effects. So setting the scene, we know the state highways are really important for access, tourism and so on, electricity, and there's relatively little redundancy across the South Island. We've got a long, skinny island, relatively few routes, and loss of those key assets are going to inhibit emergency response and long-term recovery. I'd really strongly draw you towards what happened in Kaikoura. In some ways, it's a great dress rehearsal for what we might see here following an Alpine fault, where the road and rail disruption with few alternate routes was a key issue. We'd learnt a lot around casualty estimation, so very fortunate in that event, there was very few deaths, but a lot of injuries still, and that gave a lot of insights as to what we might see there. Building damage, some of the social impacts, economics, and so on. So some of the work that we've been doing is, this is a exposure map looking at where co-seismic landsliding from an Alpine fault earthquake may inhibit the state highway network. So what we've estimated here is where we think, or where the modelling suggests that the highest incidences of landsliding as a result of the earthquake may disrupt the road network. So you can see the Alpine passes are highly exposed, and then there's some key parts across State Highway 6 on the west coast which also are badly affected, just as per usual around Franz Joseph and Fox Glacier and some of that difficult country there. Well worth drawing attention to the east coast routes. They're all looking pretty good across our nice flat Canterbury Plains. But this modelling doesn't include the high instability in North Canterbury that's happened since the Kaikoura earthquake. So we would probably expect to see some disruption in through there, as that rock mass has been pretty heavily shaken recently. This is some work. It's a little bit of a difficult map to see on the projected like this. But what we tried to do is work with NZTA and different civil defence and emergency management group staff, looking at where prioritisation of restoration may occur. So what you're seeing is the 5 different maps here are different slices in time. So time 0 on the left through to the first day, first week. Day 1 is on the left. Then the second map there is 1 week after the event, then 1 month, then 6 months, and then after 6 months. And we've found this to be a really useful exercise for the infrastructure operators to think around what their restoration priorities might be, but also to communicate with different communities as to how long they may not have access to some of their essential services. I would pull out here the expectation is that Arthur's Pass may not reopen for 6 months after an event like this. Much of the lower part of State Highway 6 may also not reopen. And this is based on the assumption that it's there's access and resources that are available to be used, but some of the potential impact and damage there will become a political decision as to whether we reopen those routes or not, just like State Highway 1 was after the Kaikoura earthquake. But it does give you a bit of a sense how things might change through time. The electricity network looks pretty similar. So Transpower has put a huge investment into strengthening their assets over the last 20 years. So again, it's just getting those feeds across into the West Coast out of the main transmission network. But there's been quite a lot of focus around how the big generators, the hydroelectric power dams in the southern parts of the South Island, how they may perform. They're internationally assessed as looking pretty good. But as we know with disasters, some weird things can happen, and there's some really key vulnerable nodes. So a lot of the powers, for example, is all routed through Benmore and their big switching yard there, with very steep slopes all around there. So whilst the assets are well run, well maintained, and looking pretty good, they still are in vulnerable country.
Councillor Ellis has got a question.
Thank you. Just going back to the roading network, we're not so much at risk with landslide, but Ashburton's very vulnerable to bridges. You know, the Rakaia Bridge we know is a very old bridge. We've got our own Ashburton Bridge and then a Rangitata one. Is there any modelling on the likely effect of those with this sort of magnitude earthquake?
Can I cover that off later on? I've got some sort of thoughts from NZTA as well as our Lifelines people on the likelihood of damage to our bridges.
Okay, and so that's the same sort of plot looking at electricity restoration through time. So the expectation, if nothing goes wrong with the dams, they'll shut down for the first day, they'll do their safety checks, and then the expectation, if nothing has gone wrong, there's no damage or whatever, is that they'll be back up and generating within a week. And as long as that network's functional, we should be, juice should be working through the networks. Now, it's worth keep in mind here, this is the transmission network, it's not the distribution network, so it's not what Electricity Ashburton would be. We haven't modelled that. Telecommunications, really important post-disaster and for community wellbeing. Again, likely we'll have some disruption here, both through loss of power and potentially through loss of access to sites. The work that's been done here around restoration of these networks, there's been quite a lot of detailed planning, and since the AF8 project's been initiated, a lot of those agencies or organisations have picked up and run with this in their own way. So what I suspect I'm presenting here is probably starting to get a bit dated now, because a lot of these agencies have really run with this, and I'm not sure where they've got to with it. I'm sure they're looking pretty sharp. But the point being, I think, is an important one, is that we'll have a lot of aftershocks in these areas, and we will have landslides which will continue to keep coming, just as we've seen after the Kaikoura event. So whilst we'll get these things, or we may get some of the infrastructure networks back up and going again, they will be exposed to ongoing challenges. There's just an example there, but for the sake of time, I'll carry on. Some of the work we've been trying to do is looking at how the whole thing might pull together. So all the different infrastructure networks may restore through time. And as we know, with power and road and whatnot, they're dependent on each other. This is some work that we've been working with Cambridge University in the UK, looking at how the different infrastructure networks might cumulatively recover through time. So as power and road in particular come back up online, we start seeing more and more of the island networks being restored. Now, this isn't a severity map, it's more just how are we seeing different infrastructure networks coming back up. And there's a lot of assumptions in here, but it's a useful, perhaps, figure conceptually to show in the first week we're likely to see quite a lot of disruption across the South Island, and then it'll come back through time. Other work that we've done is around casualty and welfare estimates. The major finding from the casualty estimates, which we haven't made public because they're very uncertain and they need to be very clearly and carefully explained when they're being presented. But what I can say is that the earthquake-prone buildings are still the largest contributor to fatalities in all of the modelling that's been done. And so they're likely to be the thing that's going to cause the severe casualties. Now, it's a complex issue with balancing heritage and many other values there, but we still see them as the large casualty source, particularly in South Island rural towns where there's many challenges around our earthquake-prone buildings. Building damage and impacts from secondary hazards are also likely to cause challenges there, particularly landslides. And the event will lead to a number of different welfare impacts, from psychosocial challenges and through to other issues. So socioeconomic impacts likely to continue for years to decades. We've done some macroeconomic modelling in partnership with Treasury and the Reserve Bank, and a range of different scenarios have been produced there, particularly looking at things like the knock-on through the dairy sector and so on. Some of the casualty impacts that we want to stress is that the characteristics of the earthquake will be an important factor which will influence how people may be hurt or more severely affected in this event. So the footprint and the intensity of shaking will be really important. But it's only one of many issues. So the location of people, the time of day, the season, what buildings are inhabited or not, what buildings they're standing close to, will all have impacts on how many casualties we may have from an event like this. We've been doing a lot of work trying to track where our transient populations might be. So our tourists, as they're moving around, just as we move through our different areas, it's a really tricky thing to know where anyone is in space and time at any one point in New Zealand. We're not Big Brother 1984. It's quite tricky to track where everyone is. So there's a lot of work going on there to try and resolve that a lot better. But the thing we can do immediately is around the behaviour of people will be an important determinant as to injuries. So about 50% of injuries in the Christchurch earthquake were from secondary decisions that people made. So jumping out of bed or jumping up, running into glass or doing something like that was a big contributor for some of the severe injuries which occurred after these earthquake events. So the role of education is a cheap and easy thing that we can all take ownership of very effectively for this, and will reduce our burden. But we're also very conscious that the loss of essential services, so power, water, road, etc., will also have knock-on effects. So public health demands and things will also be an issue, and for habitability. I'm going to be bold and go with the world's most unattractive slide. Once again, I'm so sorry, James, I always say this. What we've tried to do here is model habitability. So will people be able to be in their houses? What's going to be the issue for housing and whatnot across the South Island? We use a number of factors to model this, and please don't get too stressed about the exact numbers. We're really just trying to show broad order of magnitude estimates. But what we're trying to show here is where residential dwellings and commercial accommodation buildings are damaged or affected, where the outage maps from critical services being disrupted, where we have isolation from our main transport nodes, and what type of population are in our buildings. We've used that to develop a model which gives us an estimate of how many people might be potentially displaced, in a state of compromised livability, disrupted or no disruption. And I've just singled out Mid-Canterbury here, where, again, these are quite uncertain numbers, but it gives you broader order of magnitude estimates. There's relatively few people displaced, unlikely to see a lot of houses or whatnot severely damaged. We have a few in compromised livability and probably several thousand with minor disruption from loss of services and so on. But the vast majority of your district are likely to be relatively unaffected from a habitability perspective. And a lot of those compromised livability and minor disruption numbers are coming from your inland areas up towards the hills, where being cut off from infrastructure, networks and so on. Now, they're a little bit, as I stress, that's just a model, and remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This one we've tried with the Kaikoura earthquake and tried to calibrate it against real-world data, and it broadly shows reasonably useful numbers. So it just gives you a bit of a sense as to where the problem areas might be. Perhaps unsurprisingly, West Coast has a high number of displaced and compromised livable people. But Ashburton District seems to come up all right. Okay, so on to the sort of wrap up here, and then I'm going to hand over to James. But just a few key take-home points that I'd really like to stress. So there's a very high chance that the next Alpine Fault earthquake will be a magnitude 8. There's very, very good scientific data to suggest that. I know it's uncertain. I wish I could sit here and tell you exactly what it'll be, but in my professional experience, it's as good as you're ever going to get. The effects will extend across the South Island and probably into the lower North Island as well. There will be widespread secondary hazards, and they may be some of the most challenging to deal with, particularly in a district like Ashburton. So your landsliding, liquefaction may be challenging, both in the immediacy and in the long term. There will be areas isolated for long periods of time, potentially in your district and most likely in your neighbouring districts as well. So you may need to provide assistance there. And extended utility service outages are likely. But again, remember, this is all based off one scenario. Scenarios are quite useful as a way to pull together everything and show something off, but scenarios very rarely happen as we think they might. So the process that we're going through here for the planning and the organisation, I think is really, really valuable, but don't be surprised if it's a bit different on the day. Strong pre-existing networks, really essential, and I think that's been a real benefit of the AF8 project, where we've, as James said before, really unprecedented levels of collaboration and cooperation, and it's been a real pleasure to be involved with it, and real pleasure to be here with you today as well. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember you've got some little Methven kid sitting here saying an Alpine fault will happen again today. So the preparation that we can do is absolutely essential. And whatever we do may not be for the Alpine fault, it could be for one of the other many faults that we have across the South Island. But it's all valuable stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Probably a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one. So what sort of emergency kit and how often would we need to revive them? Because we're going to store water, we're not going to store it for the next couple hundred years.
One for you, James.
I think that, you know, the message of sort of the 3 to 4, I can't remember the numbers right now, 3 to 4 litres per person per 24 hours is sort of the recognised storage of water. But I know after some of our, you know, the Christchurch earthquake and Kaikoura earthquake, more realistically, if you want to live comfortably, maybe up to 8 litres of water per person per day. Luckily here in Canterbury we've got such, you know, fantastic water most of the time, that storing it in you know, clean used fruit juice containers or purpose bought water storage containers means that our water keeps for a long time. I know that we stored water after so that sort of millennial bug stuff they used to talk about, and we had it stored at Environment Canterbury for 10 years, and then we tested it and found nothing wrong with it. Stored in, you know, plastic, 20-litre plastic containers, not completely in the dark, so in a you know, in a darkened room but still light, and that water was still perfectly safe to drink. So yeah, you don't have to necessarily go and buy, you know, bottled water for this sort of thing. And you know, the other things that, you know, you often hear about in get-ready kits, I think, you know, more and more we're trying to say now, don't necessarily have them in a special box somewhere that, you know, gets forgotten about, and then when you go to use it, it's no good because it's time expired. It's about having stuff stored in your house that you're using continuously but refreshing it, that you know where it is, and if you had to leave your house, you can go and get it.
Their children and grandchildren are the ones that ask those sorts of questions. So no doubt the press will put some of this out when they, because there's a wee bit of scary things out in there. So the next question is, how are they going to look after themselves?
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's the first thing. How are you going to look after yourself? How are you going to look after your family? How might you be able to help support your neighbour? And I know the work that James has been doing, you know, with community resilience plans, focuses on those types of questions, which is, you know, really brilliant. Shall I carry on with this bit and then allow time for sort of good question and good discussions? I thought just with the framework here, a safer framework's been in place now, and it goes through the scenario as Tom's talked to us, goes through a bit of discussion around how, from a South Island point of view, we're going to work together, our roles and responsibilities, and then the various components, your reconnaissance, telecommunications, logistics, how we'll make that work, and then a bit about time frame. I've got a mission statement here. I'm not going to read it out to you. It's that pretty common thing: saving lives, providing for the immediate short-term needs of our affected communities. Coordination and control, a lot of this is around thinking about, in those first few days, how we will work together across the South Island. We've got some assumptions in the framework, and James has got a copy of the framework, so he can sort of share that if we need to. But some of the assumptions are is that we're not going to end up with a lot of national support and coordination in those first few days. They're going to be impacted by this as well, or most likely will be. Therefore, we need to think a little bit around what will we do ourselves in those first few days. And, thinking about that from an Ashburton point of view, it's about Ashburton being able to very quickly ascertain what's happened in Ashburton after this has happened, so that then we can say what's happened in Canterbury, and then we can look at how Canterbury can look after itself and our neighbours. Really interesting, and I'm sure you know this, but when we look at the different agencies, government agencies particularly, and the emergency services across the South Island, they all cross different boundaries. So we have these boundary issues that we need to work with when emergencies occur. DHBs, St John, police, fire, where work and income and other government departments are. So that becomes part of thinking about how we're going to coordinate and collaborate together. Interestingly, we've looked at who's going to look after who, or who's going to help each other out. So for the West Coast, for Grey and Westland districts, we're looking at Canterbury going in to help them, Nelson Tasman into the West Coast into Buller, down at Haast in the south of West Coast Otago. Marlborough will come and probably look after Kaikoura, as they did in the Kaikoura event. If there's landsliding on the Hunderlees like there was previously, we're not going to get there. Queensland Lakes presents quite a significant issue with the roading into there and the lakes themselves, so possibly Southland and so forth. So we are going to become one big community that has to look after ourselves and support each other. I've got a whole lot of objectives here. I'm not going to go through those. I'll leave. Can we? They're in the plan. Cool. So there's a whole lot of objectives here that we need to go through. I can leave them with the presentation with James to share with you later on. But I think the next step is the implementation plan. So this just goes through sort of what are the next steps that we want to do. We've transitioned from a project of establishing the plan or the framework to now how do we implement, how do we actually start doing the bits that are going to make a difference. So we're going through that at the moment, and throughout Canterbury particularly, we're starting to get each of our TAs to look at what they're going to go and do to make the assessment as quick as possible after this happens, the assessment in their own area. What else have we got here? The science side of it's going to continue to work. We've actually got some presentations coming up very, very soon, 2 communities in Mackenzie district, so Mount Cook and Twizel. Once that's finished doing its rounds, we hope to be able to get a hold of that material and use it in the greater Canterbury area rather than just in 2 places. So watch that space. We may have a road show that we can bring into Ashburton. I'm not going to say when, but sometime. What else is important here? I think the other thing that's becoming important in this space is we're switching into very much how do we inform the community about this. So presentations to you as councillors is really important because you can now have meaningful discussions with your community when you're out talking with them around what you now know. Exercising, just be aware, and I've talked to James a little bit about this, but we'll have a relatively large-scale exercise here for the South Island in November 2019. I'm not quite sure how we'll integrate our territorial authorities at this stage, but there will be a role for you in that. And then the very big one is in September 2020, is a whole of New Zealand, whole of government exercise into this. And we really want to use that to educate our North Island friends that they're going to have to help us. So discussion, local planning. I know, James, you've already presented on your plan, haven't you?
That's just what when you finish up
So-
there and you head away.
Cool. So there's,
So goal 2 is that plan.
yep, so I know James has created a plan, it's looking pretty good, and I think you'll see benefit in it. There's the regional planning that will follow from that. But coming back to your question about the bridges, the Lifelines team here have been doing a lot of work with all of our TAs and all of our Lifelines infrastructure on a piece of work we're calling Risks and Resilience. And the whole idea of that is to look at what are our critical points and what are our pinch points within our Lifelines utilities, and are there any hazards that will impact on a significant number of those at once. But in the process of doing that, Mark Gordon, who chairs or runs these projects, I asked him to find out from NZTA just what they thought of the Rakaia Bridge and the Rangitata Bridge. And I'll just read a statement here. The view I obtained from the discussion was that the failure during an AF8 event was not considered highly likely, although some damage could possibly be expected. So that would be potentially slight structural damage and possibly slumping of the approaches. So the thoughts are that yes, damage could occur, but not the sort that's going to completely close those bridges. Now, it's like rolling a dice, it could still happen. So we've still got to think about what could happen in that case of one of those bridges having a failure, but the likelihood is not high. So I think that's good to know. Probably NZTA have looked at whether those bridges need to be strengthened. It's come back that strengthening won't significantly change them. If there was a message to go out anywhere into government around those bridges, it's more likely to be, if we're thinking from a resilience point of view, is actually build a second bridge so that you're reducing the chance of both failing. So I'm not sure how you can use that piece of information, but that would be the push if you had the opportunity. if I can say that in a careful kind of way. So, chance for any questions?
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm not shaking in the boots yet, but it makes me well aware. With water storage, if we get a shaking in the bits and the pieces, and it's going to be the number 8, what will be here? We've got a lot of farms who have storage facilities. Will they all be gone, or how will it be more an hazard than a good thing?
As far as irrigation schemes, are you thinking? Tom and I had a talk about this the other day, and while I don't think irrigation schemes have been particularly looked at, we would expect damage to those. Each of the ones where there's dams or large water storage, they have to do an assessment, and I sometimes do get to see those assessments, as does James, and most of the time they look reasonably resilient, but they could fail. If they don't, then they are a source of water.
Further out there? We'll leave that on. Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just keen to understand when you said best form of resilience is a second bridge. Are you referring to all of our bridges, or specifically were you referring to just the Rakaia and the Rangitata?
I'm thinking more Rangitata and Rakaia. The other ones, temporary bridges, would come into the South Island, military ones or other things. So you could span those ones. It's just our big ones that we can't span with those types of devices. Yeah. And I mean, I'm not suggesting at all we can afford it or anything, but if we were thinking, how do we make ourselves resilient to something like this, that would be the way.
Okay, and supplementary, Mr. Chairman. Just in regards to electricity, have I understood correctly that there are only a limited number of pylons if there is an incident? What is our stockpile of pylons nationally?
Do you know, Tom?
I do, and I've just forgotten it. 20 to 30. It's not a lot, and they're just temporaries. Distribution companies like Electricity Experten, Orion, etc., they tend to have much higher numbers for restoring their distribution networks. But from a Transpower point of view, they are nervous, but particularly for accessing to the West Coast. Hence, there's been a lot of work done to try and increase the generation capacity on the West Coast itself. Probably the thing I forgot to talk about is if we lose a transformer, a big transformer from Transpower, that's a bad day for New Zealand, because they tend to take 2 to 3 years to get back into the country. And because they're so valuable, we don't have a lot sitting around waiting to go. So, like I said before, Transpower's put a huge amount of resource into strengthening and looking at keeping their assets going as best they can. It's worth noting with Darfield and Kaikoura, we didn't have big disruption to the Transpower network, so that's good. But it's also fair to say our big generation capacity, 60% of New Zealand's generation being in the lower part of the South Island, that hasn't had a good shake and hasn't tested those things. So it's really difficult to sit here and say, I think this will happen. It's worth more just saying there's a high amount of uncertainty there, but they're relatively well maintained and they're judged to be very high standard by international reviewers. So that should give us some confidence.
Anything further? Thank you, Tom and James. Very thought-provoking. Hopefully the probabilities you drift through the years, some of us are old enough probably won't see it, but just certainly you can see around where earthquakes have moved things, where some coal are and a few other things. So we know there's been some violence before to get quite what we've got out there. So thanks for that. And call on James. You might as well, while you pack up, James, you want to say anything? You move to to page 5, and there's the district earthquake plan there, the initial response plan. Yeah. You can just pack up quietly. James is just going to talk while you do it, because if you've got 5 minutes to stay around, there's no doubt we've got some more questions, and you'll be here for the whole day, but we won't ask you to do that. Yeah, do you see any changes you need to make in it? Page 13, I think we talked about one we won.
On page 13 was the review dates. So when I initially drafted this, I put it on a 2-year review date. The group Canterbury plan runs on 5 years review date. So I'm going to alter this plan so it sits on a 5-year review date. The issuance of this plan is of March for this year, so it'll be 5 years from this month.
And anything that turns up in between times can be altered at any stage?
Yes, it's a living document, so if we have additional research and I haven't seen the liquefaction data, but if I can get my hands on that, I'll build that into this plan as well.
Looks pretty good. If the rest just read it cover to cover and understand it all and want to ask any questions. Councillor Brown?
Well, it's not a question, it's just in the page 50, it's the appendix glossary, and it's on page 50, you talk RDR, it's the Rangitata division race, not the rural division race. But apart from that, the rest of the document looks very good.
Through you, Mr Chairman, we actually had this discussion because I gave James that same feedback, but apparently with group, they do refer to rural diversion races because it's not just the Rangitata one. Is that what you told me?
That is correct, but this is a local plan. So if it's more commonly known as the Rakaia or Rangitata, it can be changed so it's clear for the community.
Well, I think if you talk to the community and you said RDR, it would mean the Rangitata division race. The other races, you need to call them something else if you've got other races.
No, there'll be none other, that's just, this plan's specific to this district, so it can be changed.
Thank you. Under page 24, we've got Ashburton District Council and specific response tasks. We're in our new IL4 building here as we speak, which is quite good to be having this conversation in here. But I think one of the first things we have to do is we have no, in the event of a magnitude 8 earthquake, there will be no water here, there is no toilets here that will be able to be used. And we were told when this building was built, one of the first things they will do is contact ACL to get those things brought in so that this building can operate as an IL4 building. Does that need to be one of our specific response tasks to make sure that happens so that this building can operate fully?
Those instructions will sit underneath the standard operation procedures for the emergency operations centres. So this plan is district-wide for each of the response agencies, but the contracting of ACL for water or for temporary toileting for the emergency operations centre will be underneath the standard operating procedures for the EOC.
Councillor Lovett.
I was just looking at the audience on page 11, 1.4. Where does selected members sit within this? Is it an admission?
The plan is actually for the emergency services. It's not aimed at the governance for the response level. If we activate it, the governance will then fall underneath the standard operating procedures for the EOC and for notification through the controller and then through the mayor.
Right. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Page number 12, item G, water. During the recent presentation, we were talking about irrigation companies, and while you've identified water as potable waste and storm, is there also a need to include stored water? Because the response I just heard in the previous presentation was stored water would probably be accessed in an earthquake response.
I'm sorry, in regards to the stored water for what, please?
Stored water.
Yes, for who, sorry?
For irrigators, but I also heard under civil defence that it would be accessed under emergency responses. That's what I thought I
Okay, the
heard.
stored water. Well, I haven't put that into a context in there, but that would be a conversation I can have with the irrigation companies for access in there that can be built into this plan.
Excellent, and that was why I asked the question. Thank you. I have a second question, this time on page 13, under the secondary hazards may affect the region, and you identified fire, flood and tsunami. We saw in the modelling that landslides might not be a big issue in this area, but you've quite rightly identified liquefaction and bridge outages so liquefaction, is that a possibility to be added to that list?
I would think you'd need to have a look at what that research data is for the amount of liquefaction, then look at that in regards to the entire district to see if that's a hazard. During the consultation period where we did the vulnerability assessment workshops in September of last year, landslides were discussed with the groups that were there. I initially had that in the plan, and we removed it based on the lesser risk for the landslides and left fire, flood and tsunami in there.
Thank you. And on page 24, item item C, support evacuation of patients and casualty transport with Ashburton Hospital and St John Ambulance. Does St John Ambulance take the lead on rest homes as well, or is that an area that we should be considering?
No, it's public health. The Canterbury Public Health have the lead on the rest homes.
That the plan you've got for Methven they have a simple plan as well, which will fall in if you need to use them, isn't it?
That's correct. So we currently have community response plans for Methven, Rakaia and Mount Summers, with my plans to do Hinds and hopefully Mayfield this year as well. And then we can start looking at the Ashburton town itself and see how we develop a community response plan for that one. That will be a lot larger. And additionally, as we go along, we still have other smaller communities that may want to have their own, and it's just looking how we can actually develop plans for a smaller community as well if they think they need one.
Councillor Brown?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Standard operating procedures, which sit underneath this, have they been developed yet?
Yes, we have standard operating procedures that are already developed. This plan was McDem asked in May of this year. That was when that Safer Framework document was actually given to the civil defence groups and down to territorial authorities. And with the issuance of that was the development of this plan. So we already had standard operating procedures.
Yeah. The earthquakes, but you do have another plan to cover nearly everything else, so.
Yes, that's correct. There is the major document we have is the emergency management plan. Earthquakes were one of the identified risks. There were 7 major risks for the district identified in that plan, but after the Safer Framework document came out, all groups were asked to actually make specific plans for a major earthquake, and this is what's the outcome of it.
Is it out there? Yes.
I'll move the recommendation as stated.
Happy to second that.
Mayor?
May I just ask another question, please? This time on page 24, item E. Establish contact with community members identified in the district community response plans. So there is Methven, Rakaia, Mount Summers, Mayfield and Hinds, and I note that Mayfield and Hinds are still to be created. If there was an outage on the Ashburton Bridge and Tynwald was somewhat isolated, do you believe it's fairly easy to just get through there? I don't know if there'll be floods, I don't know what the other consequences will be.
I think when we developed that Ashburton plan, there's two schools of thoughts on there. That they're 2 distinct plans, one for Tynwald or one for Ashburton. I would like to approach that it's one plan, but with the scalability that if we only have to activate the side for Tynwald, then we use the plan just for Tynwald.
Page 68. Somebody like to move the activity reports be received? Thank you, Councillor Lovett, Councillor Urquhart. Thank you. Just letting our team get settled in there. All those in favour will receive the report, please say aye.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just highlighting that the consent numbers for January, February are pretty much similar to the previous year. But if you look at the value of work year to date on the February report, you'll see the difference between 7 million and 22 million. That was one consent basically, which was the chicken farm out at Rakaia. So that's the difference in the value of work to date.
Any questions out there? Page 69. Keep going through. Too well put together, Michael. No questions. Thank you. Move on. Ian, would you like to run through anything you see there, planning?
Don't think I have too much to add, Mr. Chair, except to say that it was a quiet start to the calendar year this year for us. Quite a lot quieter than previous years recently.
Limbs look like they're about the same, so you're just pottering along at the office at the best speed you can. Anything further? Madam Manager, do you want to say a few words?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't think of anything to say for once.
No? Madam Mayor, you need quite happy? Good. Thank you. Right, we'll
Always
close the
happy.
meeting. Thank you for your attendance. And we've had a record meeting, so never let that happen again. I don't want to have these long ones.
Righto, we'll have a 10-minute break or else get a cup of coffee and bring it back.